Roger Corman is best known for directing B-movie horror films, but in 1962 he made a civil rights movie called The Intruder, although it was re-released as I Hate Your Guts and Shame. When a movie is re-released with a different title, that's usually not a great sign, and The Intruder turned out to be the first film that Corman lost money on. He lost money even though it cost him almost nothing to make the film. The Intruder was a flop, and it turned Corman away not only from civil rights films, but away from films with any kind of overt messaging. When you look back at this movie today, though, you don't really find a flop, but instead one of the edgiest and rawest civil rights films of the 1960s. In some ways, I don't think The Intruder was topped until Mississippi Burning, which came out 26 years later. That's a big claim, probably not true, but the point is that this movie is way ahead of its time. It was an anomaly, both in how aggressively it unveiled racism in the American South, but also in some other more subtle ways. The fact is that this is kind of a weird movie. For the most part, The Intruder is a classic film, drawing a lot from the era of serious social problem films, but it's also a Roger Corman film with plenty of sleaze and cynicism and a bunch of horror tropes. The screenplay was written by Charles Beaumont, based on a novel written by Charles Beaumont. Beaumont was an author who contributed a number of scripts to The Twilight Zone, and we have some of that vibe here, too. The Intruder was also an independent film, and this is where it gets its edge. It's not really beholden to the Hollywood rulebook. It's not really beholden to Hollywood respectability, and that allows it to cover some territory that we really didn't see much. I'll walk through the movie from the beginning and give some examples of these things, but first let me say that we have a really cool cast here, led by William Shatner, who has actually been in a lot of interesting sort of off-the-beaten-path movies. This was 4 years before Star Trek started, so he was not particularly well known. But even once Shatner was widely known, he was more of a television actor, and his film credits are kind of an odd assortment of things. Nonetheless, he does a great job here, playing a manipulative social reformer who comes to a small southern town to stir up resistance to integration. The rest of the cast is mainly character actors like Frank Maxwell, Charles Emhart, and Leo Gordon, who is phenomenal. Corman gets a lot out of all the actors in the movie. The author, Charles Bowman, also appears in the film. Like I said, this movie takes place in a small southern town called Caxton. Don't think it's a real place. It was filmed in the South with the crew having to be somewhat discreet about the nature of what they were making, having to skedaddle out of town a couple times. We start out with an absolutely classic Roger Corman shot of a bus rolling into town. Something about the way the camera drives down Main Street tells you. You just know you're watching a Roger Corman movie. You know you're coming to kind of a cursed place. Just the way the camera floats into the town, down the Main Street. You think this is a town that's going to be on fire before too long. This is a town that's going to be overrun by ants before too long. Shatner's character, Adam Kramer, is on this bus. He gets off it and goes to the local hotel to check in, and here you get a big dose of some tropes and some sleaze. And I don't mean this in a bad way. This movie has an endearing B-movie feel to it, but I also think this sleaziness and cynicism is important to how the movie is balanced and how it functions. When you walk into the hotel, there's something biblical on the television. There's the smooth-talking outsider in Adam Kramer. There's an old woman at the hotel desk, and she's got a lazy husband lounging around in the lobby. The movie doesn't tip its hand immediately. It isn't totally clear why Kramer is in town or how he feels about integration. But it doesn't take long for the film to stake out some edgy territory. When Kramer asks the receptionist about integration, she says she hates it, and then she says the N-word a few times. This is the first of many slurs in the film, and it's kind of jarring to hear. This is one of the most obvious aspects of this being an independent film. Hollywood has long had a reputation as being somewhat progressive. Depends who you ask. Some people would say it's radically leftist or something. Other people would assure you it is not. But Hollywood has for a long time sold some kind of progressive messages, even as it retrenches other more regressive things. Hollywood likes a story about love, about breaking down barriers, about belief, inclusivity, friendship. It's sort of apolitical progressivism. And of course, it's changed a bunch from era to era. There's been times of populism and times of more nationalism and it's changed. But in general, Hollywood has been somewhat on the progressive side. I guess at the end of the 1950s, in particular, there were a number of serious social problem films, like Judgment at Nuremberg, another movie William Shatner was in, by the way, On the Beach, Inherit the Wind, and a number of other films directed by Stanley Kramer, and a number of films produced by Stanley Kramer. These tended to be kind of high-class social dramas with a lot of historicism. Some of them were set in the past, others were set in the present, but they had, I think, a very historical lens. These were respectable movies, somewhat intellectual, looking at serious social problems, but let's just say that they weren't about to have a bunch of slurs in them, and they weren't about to pull back the curtain on anything too dark happening in America when they came out. Now, don't get me wrong, Judgment at Nuremberg, I think, is an all-time great movie, one of the greatest casts in any film ever, I think. A phenomenal movie. But I guess the question I'm asking here is, why were none of these movies, if Hollywood had this progressive strain to it, and if the 1950s were this, or the late 50s and the early 60s had all these social problem films in them, why weren't there more movies about civil rights at the time? Stanley Kramer did make some movies about race, like The Defiant Ones and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I haven't actually seen either one of these, but my impression is that they are more about interpersonal race relations and how they can be transformed than they are about civil rights. And I don't think they're quite as incendiary as this movie, which shows us a town and really an entire world filled with hate. It's interesting. Of course, the thing that really maybe makes The Intruder sting was that its accusations were, for the most part, probably true. Why else would Hollywood have spent so much time tiptoeing around them? Why wouldn't there be other civil rights movies? You wonder why this movie was a flop. Partly it's too preachy and too on the nose, but it also may have been way too close to home. Corman never really found a distributor who wanted to take the risk. That's one very clear way in which this movie is an outlier and way ahead of its time, is that there really weren't that many civil rights movies in Hollywood for quite a long time. Later in the 1960s, we'd start to get blaxploitation films. I have a couple videos on those on the channel. That's kind of a different kettle of fish entirely. And like I said, in some ways, it's not until, at least out of what I've seen, you get to Mississippi Burning to tell the story rigorously, intensely. It's interesting. After Adam checks into his hotel, he immediately goes to work on the people of Caxton, including a young girl. She's a high school student working at the soda fountain at the corner store. Again, this is sleazy stuff with Adam clearly trying to become intimate with an underage girl here. And while it might be a little off-putting, I think the sleaze here is an important part of the movie. Without it, we would just see a young man, very polite, very courteous, talking to the townspeople about current events. It's the sleaze that hints that something isn't quite right, that builds the tension, that locks in with some of the other horror tropes, like the score. If Adam weren't a bit sleazy, the suspenseful music wouldn't really make any sense. I guess Adam isn't the only sleazy one. The people of Caxton, despite their southern charm, also seem to have something to hide. Like I said, the opening shot of this, just the way you drift into the town down Main Street, you get the feeling that the town's going to be on fire. And this cynicism, which I guess goes hand in hand with a little bit of the sleaziness, I think is a big piece of this, is a big signpost that something isn't right in the American South and in the town of Caxton. And it ends up being part of the moral engine of the film. The cursed town or the cursed family is a classic horror trope. There's a lot of movies about this. And there's a number of movies that repurpose the dynamic to talk about overt social issues. Many of them might stand in for more social undercurrents, but there's some very overt ones. It wasn't too long ago that I reviewed the great movie The Stepford Wives, for instance, and of course the terrible remake, The Stepford Wives. There's Hot Fuzz about the English countryside. There's Get Out. There's lots of movies, and a lot of these light the fire with something a bit uncanny. That's kind of the way that something is wrong, and the way that the film, despite not having any characters to stand up morally, at least not for a while, can show you that people are in the wrong. Remember, if you didn't know better, if not for some subtle balances in the movie, if not for the sleaziness, you might think that Adam Kramer is a good guy. I mean, he is the main character. He's this young, smooth talking, seemingly somewhat sophisticated protagonist rolling into a town. If not for the sleaziness, he would be the good guy. So very important the way that it balances the movie, because that's completely the opposite of the story that Corman wants to tell you. Now, an interesting thing about this scene between Adam and Ella, the girl at the soda fountain, is that Adam, the moves that he puts on her are Hollywood moves. Throughout the film, you might describe him as a movie star. And while he tells most of the people that he meets that he's just come in from Washington, D.C., he admits that he's actually from Los Angeles. This is an interesting angle. I don't know how much to read into it, but you might think that Corman would position Hollywood as the good guys. Instead, it's possible that Hollywood is the intruder. That's another interesting question about the movie, by the way. The intruder, it's not spelled out who the intruder is exactly. I guess it's somewhat clear that it's probably Adam. But what does he stand for exactly? I don't think it's a major idea of the film, this Hollywood connection. It's probably more than anything just another case of sort of B-movie cynicism, this sort of dark twist that it's Hollywood all along or something like that, or that he's from Los Angeles. But that's kind of interesting, and there's a little bit of a meta question about film in here. For the most part, this movie is not, I think, that deep, though. The opening of the film is really pretty slick. Adam brings a gun to Caxton. It's not exactly clear why. For a moment, it seems like he might intend to shoot somebody to resolve this integration issue, but it turns out to be more symbolic of the violence that he will later foster. Adam rather childishly pretends to shoot at people outside his window. This moment presages the movie. There's a great cut from the gun to the soda fountain where Ella works. This really doesn't feel like a B movie or like a cheap movie. The style is nice. There's a couple janky shots here and there, and it's kind of a short movie. There's a number of things that aren't very thorough. For instance, Adam takes a cab to the black side of town. They refer to it as something else, of course, and he stays there for about 10 seconds, checks things out, and leaves. We could have benefited from a little more detail here and a little more rigor, but the movie just kind of flies by. This taxi ride is the first that we see of black characters, and it'll take us a little bit longer to hear much from them. At first, it might seem like the movie is leaving out a big part of the story, but I think once we meet Joey Green and some of the other black students and their families, we get a pretty good perspective. The movie starts right before the start of the school year, right before what is to be the first integrated school day in Caxton. There is a great scene right before school starts at the black church where the pastor invites the children to come together and preaches to them, and they pray together. This is another signpost that this is going to be a serious movie. I mean, this is a beautiful, beautiful scene. Now, the black characters in the film are somewhat in the background, I guess, and there's one or two goofy lines, but for the most part, I think the movie holds up, and there's even a little bit of subtlety here and there in what is generally a pretty mechanical movie. For instance, there are hints that not all the black characters are in favor of integration. That's kind of interesting. Something here about ingrained roles or distrust. Now, as much as I like this movie, it does have some limitations. I mentioned already that it's kind of short and that it's kind of on the nose in some places. It's mechanical. The last third of the movie in particular feels a bit contrived. You might be able to guess how it all goes. I have mixed feelings about the ending. Having said all that, I think this still has the feeling of the classic, of being a classic. I wouldn't say it's a deep movie, but it's a real humdinger. It's a fun, engaging, maybe fun's not even the right word, but it's an engaging movie. And you know, this formula of the social justice horror film, it works. You know, we've seen it time and time again, and it works. So I do think it's a shame that The Intruder isn't better known. Chance to remedy that, hopefully. You might also wonder what could have been for Roger Corman had this movie taken off and had his career not been steered more over to less overt films. So that's The Intruder. Like I said, it's an interesting movie. I think the balance of its different parts is pretty cool. The way that the cynicism, the B-movie cynicism, comes in and actually you're able to sort of harness that to give an eye-opening look at civil rights in America and race in America is pretty cool. It's also just a nice movie to watch. It holds up better than expected. To be honest, acting is great, and it's quite nicely put together, especially for a cheap, independent movie. So overall, Intruder, pretty cool.